membranes, across the pumping systems, across the output distribution connections, across every component of a facility that cannot function if any one of its critical systems is destroyed. Iran did not strike the last water plant to damage it. It struck it with cluster munitions to ensure that no single repair, no replacement of one destroyed component, no emergency engineering intervention can restore it to operation. Because cluster munitions do not create one hole that can be patched. They create hundreds of simultaneous damage points distributed across every system in the target simultaneously. The last working water plant in Israel is not damaged. It is destroyed, and the taps that were running this morning are not running anymore. They will not run again on any timeline that matters to the 4 million people who need water today. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly what cluster munitions do to industrial infrastructure that no single warhead strike produces, why striking the last facility rather than one of several changes the strategic situation from a water crisis to a water absence, what the Israeli government has and has not told its civilian population about what the destruction of the last water plant means for their immediate survival. What a civilian population with no treated water source and no restoration timeline faces in the days ahead, and why the cluster missile strike on Israel's last working water plant is the most consequential single strike Iran has conducted against Israeli civilian infrastructure in this entire conflict. Before we get into it, thanks for watching. Your support is what keeps this going, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you here. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this. Now let's get into it. To understand why the cluster missile strike on the last working water plant is categorically different from the earlier water infrastructure strikes, you need to understand what cluster munitions are and why Iran chose them specifically for this target rather than the ballistic warheads it has been using against every previous infrastructure aim point in this conflict. A ballistic warhead strikes a single point. It produces a crater, a blast radius of destruction around that crater, and structural damage that radiates outward from the impact point with diminishing intensity. Against a large industrial facility like a water treatment and desalination plant, a single ballistic warhead strike destroys the components within its blast radius and leaves the components outside it damaged but potentially repairable. The facility is degraded. Its output is reduced. But the components that survive the blast radius can potentially be repaired, reconnected, and returned to partial operation. That is why the earlier strikes on Mekorot infrastructure, which used standard ballistic warheads against primary facilities, produced a water crisis rather than a water absence. Some components survived. Some output continued. The last working water plant has been maintaining reduced but real production by operating the components that earlier strikes left intact at maximum emergency capacity. Cluster munitions work differently. A cluster munition dispenses multiple submunitions, each of which is itself an individual explosive device, across a dispersal pattern that covers a defined target area rather than a single impact point. Against an industrial facility the size of a water treatment plant, a cluster munition strike does not produce one large crater surrounded by a blast radius. It produces hundreds of individual detonation points distributed across the entire facility footprint simultaneously. The intake pumps are hit, the pretreatment filtration systems are hit. The reverse osmosis membranes that perform the actual desalination process are hit. The chemical dosing systems that make treated water safe to drink are hit. The high-pressure pumping systems that move product water to the distribution network are hit. The control and monitoring infrastructure that coordinates every process stage simultaneously is hit. Every system, every component, every piece of equipment that the facility needs to function hit simultaneously by individual submunition detonations distributed across the entire target area. You cannot repair a facility that has sustained simultaneous damage across every system it contains by replacing one component. You replace one component and three others are destroyed. You replace those three, and the control system that coordinates them is gone. You restore the control system, and the intake infrastructure that feeds the entire process is wrecked. Cluster munitions against an industrial target do not create a repair problem. They create a replacement problem. And replacing an entire water treatment and desalination facility, every system, every component, every piece of specialized industrial equipment on the timeline that a civilian population without any treated water source requires is not an engineering challenge. It is an impossibility. The last working water plant is not coming back. Not in days, not in weeks, not on any timeline that changes the situation for the 4 million people who needed it to be working this morning. Now let us talk about what a civilian population with no treated water source and no restoration timeline faces, because the abstraction of infrastructure destruction needs to be translated into the human reality it produces to be fully understood. The situation Israel's civilian population is now in is not a water shortage. It is a water absence. A water shortage is a condition where supply is insufficient to meet demand, and rationing, prioritization, and emergency distribution can manage the gap between what is available and what is needed. A water absence is a condition where there is no supply, where there is nothing to ration, where emergency distribution is not managing a gap between reduced supply and normal demand, but is attempting to substitute entirely for a supply that no longer exists. Emergency water distribution at the scale required to substitute entirely for a city's water supply infrastructure does not exist anywhere in the world as a pre-positioned capability. It exists as a humanitarian response mobilized after a disaster over days and weeks. Israel does not have days and weeks. It has the water that is currently in pipes, in tanks, in bottles, on supermarket shelves, and in whatever emergency reserve civil defense pre-positioned before the water infrastructure came down. That water is finite. When it is consumed, there is nothing behind it. The international humanitarian organizations that respond to water supply crises, the ICRC, UNICEF, the WHO, operate on logistics timelines that are measured in days from the moment a crisis is identified to the moment water trucking, purification units, and distribution infrastructure can be mobilized and operational in a conflict zone. A conflict zone with a closed airport. A conflict zone where the alternative routing channels that replace Ben Gurion are operating beyond their design capacity on military logistics that take priority over humanitarian supply. The humanitarian water response that the international community is mobilizing for Israel's civilian population is not going to arrive on the timeline that the civilian population's biological requirements demand. It is going to arrive on the timeline that a closed airport, a conflict zone, and an international logistics system that was not pre-positioned for this specific scenario allows. Those two timelines are not compatible. The hospitals are the dimension of the water absence that is producing the most immediate life